Gus, let me just start your overall report card on what you heard from the Deputy Prime Minister.
He's a great speaker, Kieran, and I think it was a fairly compelling description of the strategic circumstance. I think it was also very pleasing that he acknowledged that you can do a great deal of harm to Australia without setting a foot on Australia, which means you really have to have an ability to defend forward or deter forward, and I think that was an important call out. It clearly puts us all in on submarines and missiles, and I'm happy to come back to that because I'm not sure the world is going to be quite that simple. I think it's a relatively modest increase in defence spending when most people watching the program will have been asking the question. We know the government's been strong on rhetoric. Mr. Marles is a good speaker and he's made that case before. We were waiting to see two things, I think, from most of the audience. Are the dollars going to match the rhetoric? Is the sense of urgency for acquisition going to match the rhetoric? And frankly, a lot of people also from industry asking the question, is this sector worth our time and effort?
The reprioritisation or the cuts, was there anything there that surprises you, anything that will damage the military project over coming years?
Kieran, I'll be honest, I think that's one of the areas I was underwhelmed by. I think we described a few buildings in Canberra that won't be built, a couple of support vessels and some cuts already made to the number of armoured fighting vehicles. The sort of reprioritisation that we've seen will require a significant amount more than that. In the broad, defence budgets are spent in kind of three buckets. There is the capital expenditure, the new equipment, and we've heard a lot about, and we can anticipate that is going up, so put an up arrow over CapEx. There is a personnel fixed cost. You've got about 100,000 people in uniform. It sounds like they're going to have to put more money and effort into people. By the way, I saw quite a lot of Lieutenant Generals in the room today. We might start by cutting a few of those. And the third bucket is what we call OPEX, meaning the operating budget of defence, and that is training, ship sea days, facilities maintenance, ICT maintenance, and so on. I anticipate that more than the cuts announced today will be necessary, and given those first two buckets I described are probably increasing, I am worried that we're going to see a reduction in the operating costs, and that means potentially less training for ADF members. That has two impacts. Clearly, they're not as good at their job if we need to use them, but also potentially less satisfying work. But I also worry that it means things like sustaining important capability, spiral development of capability might be shelved. And just an important example, we went into the period of high operating tempo in Timor with probably the worst soldier equipment in the world. Our body armour was out of date, our night vision equipment was out of date. After years of investment, we've got that up to world's best practice standard. So the question is, are we going to continue to invest in the sustainment and modernisation of those equipment, or are we dropping a magnet in a bucket of iron filings around submarines and long-range missiles?
So just to pick up on those two things, on the subs and the missiles, which you clearly that's where the main game is for the government, where else should they be looking to prepare Australia for any uncertainty or any difficulty over coming decades, soon, in the near term and in the longer term?
So I think that's the important question, Kieran. I'm a supporter of a nuclear submarine, particularly the Virginia-class submarines. I'm not as convinced we'll ever have a SSK AUKUS submarine. It doesn't exist. It's a highly developmental issue with a country, the UK, who's under very significant pressure just to maintain its own capability. But I think the Virginia is an important deterrent step for Australia that will be able to reach well forward in the region and be a deterrent to coercive action. The challenge is from now until then, Kieran, and I think this need to project a confident, capable Australia as countries become increasingly belligerent or assertive. We didn't hear anything in the speech about North Korean missile capability. Chinese assertion was discussed. So the question is, what are we doing in the next 10 years? I think the acquisition of long-range missiles for Air Force, important. We have a very good Air Force already. The surface ships are a decade away. And I think this is probably understates the use of the Army. I agree we need a more mobile Army, but we need it armed to the teeth. And HIMARS, the system that was described by the Minister, which has been in the acquisition plan since 2016, is only part of the answer. We could be looking at land-based cruise missiles. We could be looking at land-based radars and sensors for an integrated air and missile defence system that could project forward and stop those sort of threats to Australia or to our deployed fleet and deployed forces. So look, they may be covered in more detail in the classified version. Mr. Marles didn't have time to go into that sort of detail, but they're the questions that I'll be asking looking forward. What happens in the decade and how are we creating that deterrence effect before these Virginia-class subs arrive?
Yep, fair enough too. Very interesting analysis as always. Gus McLachlan, retired Major General now at Bondi Partners. Thanks.
Thanks, Kieran.